look at a food web or a food chain, one question that sometimes pops up is which organism is the most important? If I only have enough funding to save one organism, what organism is it going to be? Which one is the most important? Now, a lot of people would say, well, the producers. They're the ones that make all of the energy for all the other levels, and ultimately they control, the entire food web. If you have no producers, you have no food web. And I don't disagree with that. But there's this other notion that sometimes is even more important than producers, and that's referred to as a keystone species. And there's this saying with keystone species is that some species are more equal than others. Now, all species are important and they're all equal, but some of them are more equal. Some of them are slightly more important because they hold that ecosystem together. So what is a keystone species? It's a species within an ecosystem that maintains high biological diversity. So really looking at that species diversity level, or maybe even ecosystem level. So this species, because of its interactions within that food web, is actually controlling the populations of a lot of different things and actually increasing the diversity of that area. Yes, producers are important, but there's some species that control those producers, and the way they control those producers is actually benefiting the entire ecosystem. Or the fact that this organism exists is the reason that 20 other organisms exist. It might not be a producer. The producer might support only one organism, but then that organism supports a whole bunch. There's a whole lot of ways we can look at this, but the point being, it's just an organism that has a huge impact on that ecosystem. It's not necessarily the most abundant organism. It could be an organism that there's not that many of, but they might have a huge cascading effect on the entire ecosystem when they're not present. And so they just make this really, really huge and positive impact. The word keystone, and that's what this image is showing us, a keystone is actually the name of the stone in an arch or in a bridge that's here at the very top. If you actually got rid of any of these side stones, the bridge would still be able to support itself. However, if you get rid of the keystone, everything comes crumbling down. And that's kind of the analogy of a keystone species. Now, I do want to say that not every ecosystem has a keystone species, and some ecosystems have more than one keystone species. So it's not like I could be like, oh, here we have grass and mice and snakes and hawks. Which one's the keystone? It doesn't really work that way. You'd have to really be given a story, and then you could probably pick out if a keystone exists or if it doesn't exist. But let me talk about two pretty famous examples. So the first one is the wildebeest. You probably have heard of the word wildebeest, and if you've ever seen The Lion King, you should hopefully know what wildebeest are. Wildebeest is what killed Mufasa. So wildebeest are found in the Serengeti, and I'll show you a picture here, and they have herds in the millions. It's amazing the amount of individual wildebeest exist in the Serengeti, which, if you're not familiar with the Serengeti, these are the plains areas in Tanzania and Kenya. And here is Mufasa. Actually, that's a female, but, attacking a wildebeest. So in the Serengeti ecosystem, you have a lot of different predators. You've got cheetahs, jaguars, lions, hyenas. You have a lot of herbivores, such as our wildebeest, but also things like antelope, elephants, giraffes. And then obviously you have the vegetation that they're consuming, like these grasses. A couple decades ago, there used to be a pest, or really a parasite, that infected wildebeest and actually kept the wildebeest numbers pretty low. We were able to eradicate that parasite. It was a parasite that was also affecting human cows, so we eradicated the parasite, which not only helped our cows, but also helped the wild wildebeest. And then the wildebeest numbers started skyrocketing. They no longer had this limit that was caused by this parasite. Yes, there's lions eating them and stuff, but the main thing holding them back was that parasite. And when these wildebeest exploded, things started happening. One, there's more predators, right? Lions and jaguars and cheetahs, those are fairly low in numbers. But now they have a huge food source. So their populations started to increase. But something else happened that researchers and scientists weren't expecting. They started seeing the effects, but they didn't realize what the cause of those actual effects was. And it has to relate to this picture. So here is a grassland on fire. In the Serengeti, most times of the year it's pretty dry, and not getting a lot of rain, it's dry and it's hot. And so fires are pretty common. Before wildebeest, there was tons and tons of grasses. Yes, there was wildebeest still eating those grasses and other organisms eating those grasses, but really not a ton. But now that we have wildebeest in the millions, because their population has been exploding, they've been eating a lot more of the grasses. And because they're eating a lot of grasses, there's not a lot of firewood. Yes, I realize grasses are not wood, but the point being like a fuel for fire. You know, a lightning strikes a field with 3-foot grasses that are incredibly dry, it's going to catch on fire. A lightning storm comes through and hits a field that has 3-inch grasses. The likelihood of a fire starting is pretty low. So with increase in wildebeest, we actually had a decrease in wildfires in this area. Now, wildfires aren't inherently bad. A lot of species, especially if you look at the West in the United States, a lot of species actually rely on wildfires. So far from what we know of the Serengeti, that's actually not really the case. They just happen to catch on fire, and although yes, it brings nutrients into the system, it doesn't do much else. And here's what they started seeing. Well, you get rid of all these grasses, and you have less fires. If you have less fires, that means trees can start growing. Right, if trees start growing and they're like this little baby tree, but then a fire comes through, that baby tree is destroyed. And trees take years and years to grow. So I just made it that trees can grow now. That you don't have fires coming through every couple months, every couple years, and destroying all the trees every time it comes through. Trees don't even get a chance to start growing. But there's not so much fire anymore. There's not so much fire, we can get more trees. And with more trees, we started seeing a lot more giraffes. The giraffe population has been growing, which is great because they've been listed as an endangered species. You're now seeing these huge ecosystems in the Serengeti. Yes, there's still grasses, there's still plenty of food for other organisms, but we're now having a greater abundance of trees, so we're actually increasing another producer. This other producer is helping support even more organisms. But none of this would have happened without the wildebeest. If the wildebeest wasn't eating this grass, then there wouldn't be an opportunity for more trees to grow. So this is why we would say wildebeest are a keystone species. By having more of them, there's positive effects in this ecosystem. When you have less of them, there's a lot more negative effects. Now, another one that's a little closer to home here in the United States is actually looking down in North Carolina. You can see in a couple of areas, but North Carolina is kind of famous for this. This is looking more at a straightforward food chain. We have sharks, and it's a couple of different species of sharks, but I'm just going to loop them all as sharks. We have rays, and it's really looking at one species of ray. And then we have scallops, and you're probably familiar with scallops if you have ever eaten seafood. Scallops. And North Carolina actually had a huge fishery for scallops. So just to show you some pictures, here's an example of a shark eating a ray. And then here's an example of a ray eating. These actually are oysters, but oysters and scallops are pretty closely related to one another. So quite a simple food chain. Now, if you guys know anything about sharks, you know they're hunted pretty often for a couple of reasons. One, fear. We as humans fear them. Even though sharks rarely attack people, we're terrified of them because we know if they do attack, we're screwed. So we kill them out of fear. We also hunt them, so their shark fins and their meat is a delicacy around the world, particularly in Asian countries, but they are captured everywhere. And then the other one is as bycatch. So bycatch is when a fisherman is fishing for a croaker or whatever, and they accidentally catch something that's not croaker. For example, sharks or sea turtles or dolphins. They try to release these organisms, but depending on how they're fishing, how long it's been, it might not be any use. Like the organism may already have died, or at least be injured to the point where eventually it's going to die relatively quickly. So that's kind of an overview of what's happening. So you had this stable system, and we got rid of the sharks. So I'm going to show you 3 graphs. This came from a scientific journal, and this is looking at populations of these organisms off the coast of North Carolina. So this is looking at black-tip sharks, and this is showing relative abundance. So 1 being, this is the highest abundance. We saw 500 individuals. And then down here, this would be like 0.01. So we're seeing 1% of the individuals we used to see. So here in the 1970s, we had a ton of sharks. And then I know this is only showing in 2004. Same trends are still happening. We're seeing a tiny fraction of that. Well, you get rid of sharks, what's going to go up? Right? The rays are going to go up. So what they started seeing, and these are at 2 different locations, that's why there's 2 different colors. In 1970, there was barely any. Not really any at all. And then you start getting rid of their predator, and their numbers aren't staying in check. And their population is exploding. It's increasing a lot. Well, if rays are increasing, what's going to happen to scallops? Yeah, they're going to decrease. So they increased for a little bit, but then they've decreased and they're barely at anything. The North Carolina fishery for scallops has actually collapsed. You can't go find scallops there anymore because of these rays having exploded. So here's an example of kind of how keystone species can affect humans directly. We don't care about the rays. We might not care about the sharks, but we care about scallops. And we kind of want to keep scallops around. So if we want to keep scallops around, we've got to keep sharks around. So this is showing you, like we looked at with food chains and food webs, things are interconnected. You know, when it comes to humans trying to save organisms, yes, we want to save the scallop, but instead of trying to save the scallop, if we save the shark, everything else falls in place. So that's why it's really important for scientists to really understand how ecosystems work. I know you might think, oh, these are food chains and food webs, these are so easy. And maybe they are, but as you can see, like they have some huge implications on human society. So that's why it's important to really understand these kinds of relationships. So again, as a summary, a keystone species is just a species that has a large impact on the ecosystem. It's not necessarily the most abundant. It's not necessarily a producer or a primary consumer or a tertiary consumer. It really can be any species. And the way you know a keystone species is a keystone species is if you get rid of them and that ecosystem vastly changes for the worse, then you just got rid of a keystone. Maybe you don't understand all the mechanisms as to why they're a keystone, but obviously taking them out of it changed that ecosystem. Not all ecosystems have keystone species, and some ecosystems have multiple. Testing purposes wise, I'm really going to make it kind of cut and dry. It's an ecosystem and here's the keystone, or here's an ecosystem and here's the interactions, which one's the keystone. I'm not really going to throw you guys for a loop. There's tons of examples of these, so if you're interested in this topic, definitely look into it because there's tons of really fascinating stories out there about keystone species.